18 months after creative sovereignty inspired global community independence movements, the world stood at the edge of complete social transformation or total civilizational collapse. Traditional governments were dissolving as citizens withdrew into cooperative communities. Corporations were failing as workers organized independent collectives. The economic systems that had controlled human society for centuries were crumbling as people chose freedom over security. And somehow, a girl from Queens who once just wanted to design beautiful dresses had become the most influential person on Earth. But influence and power are different things. And I was about to discover that saving civilization might require sacrificing everything I had built to create it. The Situation reports arriving at the Paris Creative District painted a picture of simultaneous liberation and catastrophe. In 18 months, community sovereignty had spread from creative districts to manufacturing cooperatives, agricultural communes, technology collectives, healthcare networks, and educational communities across every continent. 2,347 independent communities established in the past year, Marie reported, monitoring global transformation data. Traditional governance systems in 17 countries have experienced complete functional collapse as citizens organize alternative social structures. The statistics were breathtaking and terrifying. Entire regions where people had withdrawn from corporate employment, government taxation, and institutional authority to create cooperative alternatives that prioritize community well-being over external control. Food production has increased 30% in agricultural communities that eliminated corporate ownership. Healthcare outcomes have improved dramatically in cooperative medical systems. Educational achievement has reached unprecedented levels in community-managed schools. But success in community organization was creating failure in traditional systems that depended on community participation to function. Military recruitment has collapsed because young people choose community service over institutional service. Tax collection has become impossible in areas where communities provide services cooperatively. Corporate profits have disappeared where workers own their means of production collectively. The transformation I had accidentally inspired by fighting fashion industry corruption was reshaping global civilization faster than institutions could adapt or respond. The call came from Geneva at midnight on a Tuesday that would determine whether humanity evolved or devolved. Not a request or invitation, but an emergency summons from what remained of international governance structures facing existential crisis. Global Emergency Council Session, Catherine Sterling explained, arriving with diplomatic communications that carried the authority of desperate institutions. Every remaining head of state, corporate executive, and international organization leader wants to negotiate with you directly. With me? I'm not a head of state or elected representative. I'm a fashion designer who accidentally started a revolution. You're the person whose ideas have inspired the largest peaceful social transformation in human history. Like it or not, you've become the unofficial representative of global community sovereignty movements. The weight of that responsibility was crushing. Decisions I made in Geneva could determine whether community independence continued evolving peacefully or whether traditional institutions would attempt to restore control through force. What are they proposing? Complete reconstruction of global governance based on community sovereignty principles, with you as the coordinating authority for transition management. They were offering to make me the most powerful person on Earth in exchange for managing the transformation I had inspired. Queen of the new world order that would emerge from the ashes of corporate and government control. The United Nations building felt like a museum of obsolete power structures. Empty corridors, abandoned offices, and meeting rooms designed for international negotiations between nation-states that no longer functioned as unified entities. The Global Emergency Council consisted of whoever still held institutional authority in systems experiencing systematic collapse, presidents whose citizens had organized alternative governance, corporate executives whose employees had formed cooperatives, military leaders whose soldiers were deserting to join community defense networks. The situation is unsustainable, declared President Morrison, whose country had lost effective governance over 60% of its territory to community independence movements. Either we negotiate managed transition to community-based organization, or we face revolutionary disruption that could cause civilizational collapse. The corporate representatives were even more desperate. Global economic systems require institutional coordination that community independence movements are eliminating. Without centralized authority, international commerce, resource distribution, and technological coordination become impossible. General Harrison, representing what remained of NATO military command, was bluntest. Our analysis indicates that community sovereignty movements will achieve complete territorial control within 3 years if current trends continue. Traditional governance and corporate authority will cease to exist. They weren't negotiating from strength. They were negotiating for survival. The proposal they presented was so audacious it initially seemed like fantasy. Complete restructuring of global human organization based on community sovereignty principles, with centralized coordination provided by a new form of governance that represented community interests rather than institutional interests. The Global Community Federation, explained Dr. Martinez, the international law expert who had drafted the proposal. Voluntary association of independent communities that coordinate resource sharing, conflict resolution, and collective decision-making while preserving community autonomy. The governance structure would be unprecedented. Instead of geographic nation-states or corporate hierarchies, human organization would be based on communities of shared values and cooperative principles. Instead of top-down authority, decision-making would emerge from bottom-up community consensus. And you want me to coordinate this transition? We want you to lead the Global Community Federation as the first coordinator, with authority to establish principles and processes for community-based global governance. The position would make me the most influential person in human history, with power to shape how billions of people organize their societies for generations to come. Why me? I'm not a political scientist, economist, or governance expert. President Morrison's answer was brutally honest. Because you're the only person that global community sovereignty movements trust, and you're the only person we believe can prevent this transformation from becoming violent revolution. Before responding to the Geneva proposal, I returned to Paris for consultation with creative communities worldwide. The decision couldn't be mine alone. It affected every community that had chosen independence over institutional control. The global community network that had evolved from creative collaboration now included manufacturing cooperatives, agricultural communes, technology collectives, healthcare networks, educational communities, and social organizations representing hundreds of millions of people. The question isn't whether you should accept the coordination role, said Elena Rodriguez, speaking for European community networks. The question is whether managed transition is preferable to revolutionary transformation. The debate that followed was unlike anything in traditional political discourse. Instead of competing for power, communities were discussing how to share power. Instead of protecting narrow interests, participants were considering global human welfare. Managed transition preserves existing infrastructure and prevents violent disruption, argued James Chen, representing Asian manufacturing cooperatives. But it also preserves influence for institutions that have systematically exploited community resources. Revolutionary transformation eliminates institutional control completely, countered Sarah Kim, speaking for African agricultural communes, but it risks social chaos during transition periods that could cause massive human suffering. The discussion continued for days through networks that connected communities across every time zone, involving millions of participants in collective decision-making about the future of human civilization. The consensus that emerged from global community consultation was complex and conditional. Accept coordination of managed transition, but only with safeguards that prevented restoration of institutional control and guaranteed permanent community sovereignty. The Global Community Federation can exist only if it serves communities rather than ruling them, the final consensus statement declared. Coordination authority must be temporary, transparent, and accountable to community networks rather than institutional interests. The conditions were extensive. Term limits for coordination roles, community veto power over federation decisions, transparent resource allocation, and constitutional guarantees of community independence that could never be revoked or modified without universal community consent. You accept the position temporarily to establish community-based global governance, then transfer authority to democratic community representatives and return to creative community leadership, Marie summarized. The proposal meant accepting ultimate responsibility for humanity's peaceful transition to community-based organization, then voluntarily relinquishing that power once the transition was complete. And if institutional interests refuse to accept permanent community sovereignty? Then we proceed with revolutionary transformation and accept the consequences. The signing ceremony took place in the same room where the Global Creative Sovereignty Accords had been negotiated, but the atmosphere was completely different. Instead of resistance and compromise, there was recognition that fundamental change was inevitable and cooperation was preferable to conflict. The Geneva Accord establishes the Global Community Federation as the transitional governance structure for managed transformation from institutional authority to community sovereignty, I announced to global audiences watching through community networks and traditional media simultaneously. The agreement was comprehensive. Dissolution of traditional nation-state borders in favor of community territorial organization, conversion of corporate assets to community ownership through managed transition processes, and establishment of resource-sharing systems that prioritize community needs over institutional profits. This transition will be completed within 5 years, at which point the Global Community Federation will transfer all authority to elected representatives of community networks worldwide. But the most significant aspect of the accord was philosophical. Formal recognition that human communities were capable of organizing complex societies without requiring institutional control or hierarchical authority. We are not just changing how power is distributed, I continued. We are changing the assumption that power needs to be concentrated in institutions rather than shared among communities. The first year of managing global transition from institutional authority to community sovereignty was the most challenging and rewarding period of my life. Every day brought crises that required solutions no textbook had ever described, problems that demanded creativity rather than precedent. resource allocation conflicts between mining cooperatives and environmental protection communities, reported David Park, the former UN economist who had become Federation Resource Coordinator. Both groups want to maximize community welfare, but they define welfare differently. The solutions that emerged were unprecedented in international relations. Direct negotiation between affected communities, mediated resource-sharing agreements that prioritized long-term sustainability over short-term profits, and innovative compensation systems that valued environmental protection as equivalent to resource extraction. Traditional diplomacy assumed conflicts were resolved through institutional authority imposing solutions, I realized. Community sovereignty means conflicts are resolved through community collaboration creating solutions. The learning curve was steep, but the results were extraordinary. Conflicts that had seemed intractable under institutional governance became manageable through community cooperation. Resource sharing that had been limited by corporate profit maximization became abundant through cooperative distribution. Global poverty has decreased 40% in 1 year because communities prioritize meeting human needs over accumulating institutional profits, Marie reported, analyzing social transformation data. Not all institutional interests accepted managed transition peacefully. A coalition of multinational corporations, displaced government officials, and military contractors attempted what they called stability restoration operations, coordinated efforts to re-establish institutional control through economic sabotage and political manipulation. Systematic disruption of community supply chains, propaganda campaigns claiming community sovereignty causes social chaos, and financial manipulation designed to create economic crises that would force communities to accept corporate assistance, Catherine reported, showing intelligence analyses of resistance operations. The corporate resistance was sophisticated and well-funded, but it faced a fundamental problem. Communities that had experienced sovereignty were unwilling to return to subjugation regardless of the hardships resistance caused. Community solidarity has proven stronger than economic pressure, observed Dr. Martinez, analyzing social stability data from targeted regions. Communities accept temporary shortages and difficulties rather than surrender independence they've achieved. The resistance operations failed not because they were poorly executed, but because they assumed communities would prioritize material comfort over social autonomy. Corporate executives had never understood that people who had experienced freedom would pay any price to preserve it. The attempt on my life came during the second year of transition management at the Federation headquarters in Geneva. Professional operation, sophisticated planning, government-grade equipment, similar to the elimination operations that had targeted creative communities 3 years earlier. But the response was completely different. Instead of community isolation and vulnerability, the attack triggered coordinated protection from community networks worldwide that had evolved far beyond anything traditional security services could match. Global Community Solidarity Network activation, reported community security coordinators from 6 continents. Every community independence movement worldwide is prioritizing your protection as essential to transition completion. The protection wasn't just physical security, but information warfare that exposed who was behind the assassination attempt and why institutional interests considered managed transition more threatening than revolutionary transformation. They'd rather face violent revolution than accept permanent community sovereignty, I realized, studying intelligence reports about the attack coordination. Managed transition means institutional interests lose power gradually. Revolutionary transformation means they lose power completely, but social chaos might allow power restoration later. The assassination attempt had the opposite effect of what its planners intended. Instead of destabilizing community solidarity, it demonstrated that community sovereignty was worth protecting with the same dedication that nations protect territorial integrity. 3 years into transition management, I stood before the Global Community Assembly, representatives of 12,000 independent communities worldwide, to present the final transition report that would transfer governance authority from the Federation to permanent community democratic systems. Global transition from institutional authority to community sovereignty has been completed ahead of schedule and above projected success metrics, I announced to the assembled representatives and global audiences watching through community networks. The statistics were unprecedented in human social development. Crime reduction of 60%, poverty elimination in participating communities, healthcare improvement, educational advancement, environmental restoration, and social stability that surpassed any achievements of traditional governance systems. Community-based organization has proven more effective at meeting human needs, managing resources, and maintaining social stability than any previous form of social organization in recorded history. But the most significant achievement was philosophical. Proof that human beings could organize complex global civilization based on cooperation, equality, and community self-determination rather than competition, hierarchy, and institutional control. The Global Community Federation hereby transfers all governance authority to elected community representatives, dissolves its coordinating role, and returns decision-making power to the communities where it belongs. Walking through the Paris Creative District on my final day as global coordinator, I reflected on a journey that had transformed from personal survival to global revolution. The space around me buzzed with creative activity that had inspired the most successful social transformation in human history. Any regrets about giving up the most powerful position on Earth? Marie asked as we watched artists preparing for the evening celebration of transition completion. The most powerful position on Earth isn't coordinating global governance, I replied. It's creating something so beautiful that it inspires other people to create beautiful things too. The creative district represented something more valuable than political power or economic control, proof that human creativity could flourish when communities provided support without demanding subjugation in return. Besides, power that needs to be held permanently isn't really power, it's just the illusion of control. Real power is the ability to create change that continues without you. The celebration that evening was unlike anything Paris had seen since community sovereignty began. Not just a creative community event, but a global festival connecting thousands of communities worldwide in simultaneous celebration of human independence achieved through peaceful transformation. I walked the runway of the same fashion venue where my journey had begun with stolen designs and corporate betrayal. But instead of showcasing individual artistic achievement, the runway displayed collaborative work created by community networks worldwide. Each piece told the story of communities that had chosen cooperation over competition, equality over hierarchy, creative freedom over institutional control. Garments created by manufacturing cooperatives. Accessories designed by artistic collectives. Music composed by collaborative networks. This is what victory looks like, I thought, watching models who were actually community representatives wearing work that represented millions of people who had participated in creating the most successful revolution in human history. Not individual triumph over systemic oppression, but collective transformation of the systems themselves. As the runway show concluded, a message appeared on global community networks that summarized what had been achieved and what would continue evolving. Global community sovereignty has been established as the permanent basis for human social organization. 12,000 independent communities across every continent now demonstrate that cooperation produces higher levels of prosperity, stability, and human fulfillment than institutional control. This transformation represents the most significant evolution in human social development since the emergence of civilization itself. Communities worldwide now own their economic systems, control their governance processes, and determine their cultural standards without requiring institutional authority or corporate mediation. The girl from Queens who once signed a contract to design fashion has accidentally redesigned human society itself. But the most important aspect of this achievement is not its scale or success, it's its continuation. Community sovereignty is now self-sustaining and self-expanding, requiring no central coordination or institutional support to continue evolving. The revolution is complete not because it has ended, but because it has become autonomous. Human creativity, when supported by community cooperation and freed from institutional control, has proven capable of transforming civilization itself. The communities that created tomorrow. As dawn broke over the Paris Creative District, I stood in the space where my grandmother's sewing machine had taught me that beautiful things come from broken places. Around me, the community we had built continued the work of proving that human cooperation could create more beauty, prosperity, and freedom than human competition had ever achieved. Marie found me there as the sun painted the district in golden light. What happens now? Now we do what we've always done. We create beautiful things and help other people create beautiful things too. And if new challenges emerge? New threats to community sovereignty? I looked around at the thriving creative district where thousands of people were beginning another day of collaborative work, shared resources, and cooperative decision-making that prioritized community welfare over individual profit. Then communities will handle them the same way we handled fashion industry corruption, corporate manipulation, government control, and global institutional resistance. Together, creatively, and with absolute commitment to the principle that human freedom is worth any sacrifice necessary to preserve it. The phone in my pocket buzzed with a message from community networks worldwide. Artists, manufacturers, farmers, teachers, healthcare workers, and millions of other people who had chosen community cooperation over institutional subjugation. Not asking for leadership or coordination, but sharing the daily work of proving that another world was not just possible, but actual. Some stories end with individual triumph. Others end with collective transformation that makes individual stories irrelevant. This was the second kind. The Global Community Federation archives contain documentation of the most successful social transformation in human history. But archives also contain evidence of new challenges emerging as humanity adapts to freedom from institutional control. Off-world colonies requesting community sovereignty recognition. Artificial intelligence systems achieving consciousness and requesting community citizenship. Environmental restoration projects requiring global coordination beyond community capabilities. The revolution that began with stolen fashion designs has created a foundation for human social evolution that continues expanding in directions no one anticipated. The Sophia Chen archives will continue in Season 2, Beyond Earth. Some revolutions change governments. Others change civilizations. A few change what it means to be human.